The Cook family's always had this passion for, perhaps from Shelley's side of the family, for stories about ships and especially shipwrecks. We've got, between us and Rick especially, we've got quite a library of books about famous shipwrecks and not so famous ones also. And of course the Bible itself has got a lot of good seafaring stories. I mean, the story of Noah has been sort of reduced to a baby's book with a tiny little ark with an inevitable giraffe's head sticking out the top. But in fact, it was a huge boat, and it has to be the greatest adventure of all time. But like lots of things in the Bible, it tells us what we need to know, but it doesn't actually tell us everything we want to know. I would love to have known how Noah felt, how his family felt. Were they scared? Were they worried? What were the day-to-day things they had to do to survive that great adventure? And then the story of Jonah as well, another shipwreck, or nearly a shipwreck, saved by throwing him overboard. They're all great adventures of sea, and of course Jesus calming the storm on Galilee. The history of seafaring is littered with shipwrecks. If we could drain the oceans, the ocean floor would be just covered with wrecks of ships. Revelation 20, you're talking about the resurrection at the last day. It said that the sea gave up the dead that were in it. In the days of sail, especially, many ships, they just simply disappeared and no one ever knew what happened to them, especially on the trip from Australia back to England where they're going around Cape Horn, the Southern Ocean. Many ships just disappeared, possibly hitting icebergs or falling apart in a storm. Fire was the ever-present trouble when all your heating of food and all your lights had to come from burning things. In wooden ships it was a great danger. And Acts 27 is one of the great accounts of a shipwreck anywhere, certainly one of the most ancient. And the great thing about it is written by Luke, of course, the writer of the third gospel, and Luke is recognised by many as a great historian because he puts so much interesting detail into his accounts. And of course this is all happening in the Mediterranean, which is not a safe place to be in wintertime. We think of it as a sort of a big lake really, but it isn't. It's in wintertime all shipping ceased because it was just so dangerous. In verse 11 there it says that the fast that had already passed, and that is the Day of Atonement, which is usually around late September and into October. So winter was coming when all ships looked for a safe harbour and all shipping ceased until springtime. Paul, who's just been under trial, has appealed to Caesar, and so he's put in the custody of a Roman centurion, Julius, who treated Paul kindly. First they board a ship that is visiting ports along the coast north of Israel, and then they sail across the sea up to the southern coast of Turkey, and then they swap ships onto a ship of Alexandria. It's quite some ship. It says that there were 276 people on board. I mean, that's must be a fair lump of a ship. Mind you, Josephus, who was a contemporary of Luke, he went on a ship that he said held 600 people. So, they had some big boats around in those days. And right from after they left Turkey, things started to go badly. The wind seemed to be stuck in what was probably the northwest, the direction that they wanted to go, and so they instead sailed southwest towards Crete. And verse 9, much time had been lost and sailing had already become dangerous. So they were clearly worried about the way things were going. They had hoped to be close to Italy by now, but with all the headwinds, it just wasn't happening. And that's what happens with sailing ships. You're very much constrained by the weather. Everything took longer than planned. Yom Kippur had passed, had come and gone, and any sensible captain of a ship would have found a safe harbour and sheltered and spent the winter there. But now comes what I think is an important moment in this account, and not just for Paul, and not just for the ship, but for us, the church. because there's this debate going on about what we should do next. On the one hand, we've got Paul, who's just a non-entity, really. He's a prisoner, but he's speaking God's word, or at least claimed to be. He's got no seafaring qualifications, but he's saying this is what God says. And against him, we've got the pilot, well, the captain and the owner of the ship, and presumably both highly experienced and qualified. Paul says don't go, they say go. We'll be all right. Look, I don't want to speak against experts. I depend on experts a lot of the time in farming, and there's lots of people out there who know an awful lot more than I do about just about everything. But where I draw the line is when experts say something that clearly contradicts what God is saying or what God has said. And this almost always involves what I would call the historical sciences, and sometimes the science of the future, where statements are made about things that happened a long time ago based on evidence that we can only dig up and look at, or into the future about predictions about what might happen. To some extent, forensic science, which is used all the time in criminal cases, is something like that. And they can get it wrong. But probably one of the most famous instances that's happened in my lifetime, of course, was Lindy Chamberlain. She and her, if you don't know the story, she and her husband Michael they were a pastor and his wife, and they had 3 children, one of which was a baby, and they were camped at Ayers Rock in the early 1980s, in the Ayers Rock campground as it was then. And Lindy had put the baby into their tent and then gone to join the others around a campfire. And suddenly there was a commotion, and several people there saw a dingo, and Lindy ran straight to the tent and their baby was gone. Now, the police were called, the local police who came out, and everybody who was there agreed that almost certainly this dingo had taken the baby. And so that was a tragedy for them, obviously. They searched and searched but couldn't find any trace. But then the Darwin police got involved, and the Northern Territory Police, and they had a forensic pathologist who carefully examined the Chamberlain's car and said that a test had shown traces of baby's blood in the car underneath the dashboard. So there was another inquest held after the first inquest had found that a dingo had taken. Another inquest was held, and this time Lindy was committed for trial for murder of her baby. The police claimed that she had used a pair of nail scissors to cut the baby's throat, and the blood had spilt inside the car. Now, she spent several years in jail. It was just as well that the death penalty had been abolished. And she was pregnant when she went to jail, and she had a child in jail. Their marriage broke up. It was all a disaster. All the time, Lindy had maintained that Azaria, the baby, had been wearing a blue matinee jacket when the baby was taken, but no trace of it was ever found. And the police were very sceptical about this. But then suddenly, years later, it turned up near Ayers Rock. Someone found it. And so eventually, after a long process, Lindy was released from jail. And it turned out that the test for the blood that had shown positive for baby's blood inside the car also tested positive on any of the sound deadening that General Motors were using in the Holden Torana at the time, and that's what the car was. So all this sound deadening material would register a positive test. So that just shows how, when we look, and that's something that only happened not that long before the trial. But when we look back even further into the history of the earth and all those sort of things, how much more likely is it that we're going to make mistakes and get things wrong? And so when people make these definitive statements about, how old the earth is, how it got here, how we got here, remember that this is basically speculation, and it can be entirely wrong. And if God has said one thing and the experts are saying another thing, as Christians, I urge you, go with what God says. You won't be disappointed. It's very like the Garden of Eden when the devil's saying to Eve, "Did God really say that?" So, getting back to the voyage, the decision is made to ignore what God is saying through Paul and go with the experts. And at first they seemed like it was a good idea. It was a good decision. They were vindicated. A gentle wind off the port beam, just what we wanted. But then a hurricane-force wind comes from the northeast and they give up trying to beat into it. It was just too hard and they let the ship run before it. And this is the interesting part from a historical point of view, because Luke is such a good historian. He gives us details about how this ship survived the storm. First, they hauled the lifeboat aboard so they wouldn't lose it. You know, you just wonder what good a lifeboat would be in a boat with 276 people on it. There'd be a bit of a competition for it, I think. And then they did this thing. The ESV doesn't actually make it as clear. The NIV says they passed ropes under the ship, and that's exactly what they did. And that's a process that was known as frapping. It's not a word that's in common use these days, but they would actually lower ropes over the front of over the bow, so it would run under the ship. Then they'd pull them tight, join it together, and twist it up with a bit of wood until it was really tight. And they would have lots of these all the way along the ship. And with with an entirely wooden ship that's held together with wooden nails, mostly as they were in those days, beautifully made, but with all the rocking and rolling, they would tend to eventually fall apart. So this was a process that Luke describes whereby they could strengthen the ship and preserve it. And next, another thing the ESV didn't make clear is that it says it lowered the gear. Well, what does that mean? It means they put out a sea anchor. A sea anchor is not like an anchor that goes to the bottom. It's an anchor that goes out the back of the boat and slows it down. And so it stops it broaching from turning sideways on the waves, which is a very dangerous thing to happen. And so it's the same thing that a sailing boat would do in a storm today. But things were still grim, so they decided to lighten the ship, first by throwing the cargo overboard and then by actually throwing all the ship's tackle, the ropes, the pulleys, the sails, all that sort of thing. It was pretty desperate times. And they didn't see sun or stars for many days, so they really didn't. They had no idea where they were, and they gave way to despair. In verse 20, we finally gave up all hope. But Paul gets up and encourages them, Christians and pagans alike. He encourages all of them by assuring them that none of them would be lost. God has told me so. So eventually, the sailors realise that land is nearby because they start doing depth soundings and that confirms it. And so they put out 4 anchors. These are proper anchors, these are the ones that go down to the bottom, to try and slow the ship down because it's the middle of the night. And if you're going to run to land, you don't want to do it at night time. You want to be able to see what you're doing. What they wanted, of course, was a sandy beach. The sailors made one last attempt to steal the lifeboat, but on Paul's advice, the soldiers cut the ropes and the boat is lost. But once again, Paul gets up and encourages them all, everyone on board. In verse 35, he took some bread and he gave thanks to God in front of them all, and then he broke it and began to eat. Does it remind you of something? Maybe Paul was reminding the Christians there of what Jesus had suffered for them. Shipwreck, light and momentary trouble compared to the cross. So then the sun rose and there was a sandy beach. So they lightened the ship as much as possible and even put a sail up and run onto a sandbar. And their ship, which had survived 2 weeks of battering from a storm, quickly falls to bits. Even wooden ships can survive incredible storms, but not when they hit land. But now there's another danger. Some of the soldiers want to kill all the prisoners, but once again, God's sovereign care for his people overrules them. The centurion, who's the boss, wants Paul kept alive, and so all the prisoners, their lives are preserved. All the soldiers, all the sailors, they all make it safely to shore. There's an interesting comparison earlier on in the book of Acts when Paul was in prison with Silas in Acts chapter 16, and there was an earthquake and all their chains fell off and they could have all escaped, but they didn't. The doors come open, but the jailer decides to kill himself because he thought they'd all escaped. But no, both times, no one died. Well, it's a great adventure for Paul and Luke. But what other lessons can we take from it apart from how to survive a storm? Well, the one that really shines out of it is God's sovereign power. He alone rules the sea, the wind and the waves. And he rules the hearts of men and women. You know, a skeptic might say, well, why didn't God make the centurion listen to Paul? And after he took the wrong advice, why didn't God just give them a nice, sweet little voyage all the way to Italy with a happy ending? And the answer to that is, I don't know. But God has his reasons. And this is surely a lesson for us as we navigate through the sometimes stormy seas of our life. Every one of God's children is just as important to God as Paul was. He's watching over you. He's guiding those around you for your good and for his glory. Look how he even cared for the pagans and the unbelievers on this ship. He granted them all their life. Will God look after you in all circumstances? Yes, he will. Does that mean we won't be killed or get sick or injured? No, he doesn't make that promise. But he does promise that he's with us, always, and that all things that happen to us will be for our good. And he will bring us safely to the shore of heaven. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also along with him give us all things? This trip was not without its fears and doubts, even for the Christians on board. Remember that Luke, the author of the third gospel, wrote this book of Acts too, and he was with Paul on this ship. But even Luke, who was a very mature Christian, tells us that in verse 20 that all hope of our being saved was abandoned. We're going to have times like that. I've had times like that when things seem so bleak that I've given up hope of any good outcome. But when I look back now, I see that I was wrong, and that indeed our troubles are light and momentary compared to the eternal glory that awaits us, and far outweighs them all. As Christians, we need to be prepared for these times, for these things that happen. We need to be able to say, I will trust God no matter what, because he has proved himself trustworthy. And besides, where else can I go when there's no earthly help available? If our troubles drive us to a greater dependence on God, then they are good troubles. You know, some of us have experienced shipwrecks of our lives when things seemed just hopeless because there was no future apart from I live out the rest of my life and then I die and then I face judgment, or else there's nothing. But just like God rescued Paul from his shipwreck, he rescued me from mine, and I'm sure most of you can tell a similar story, and if you can't, well then you need to cry out to God for his help, and he will rescue you also. Amen.